Oh god, they finally did it. A D&D NFT. The non-fungible trident. Weapon, trident. Artifact requires attunement. You gain a +3 to attack and damage rolls made with this weapon. Whenever you score a critical hit on a creature with this weapon, they instantly die. In addition, the non-fungible trident can be used to cast the Wish spell 3 times a day. Curse. You may never actually wield the trident in a physical sense. You may never touch the trident or attune to it at all. Yes, you may have purchased it, and you do own it. However, it must stay sealed within the ancient vaults of Tyryk Sol. Instead of wielding it, you may carry a fine painting of the trident and official papers of authentication to confirm that you do technically own the trident and show just how special you are. Psst. Other creatures can make a convincing copy of this painting with a DC 10 tool check. A check otherwise known as right-clicking. As long as I can use multiple slurp juices on a single trident, this should be fine. My name is Jacob Crow, and welcome to the Crow's Perch, where we dive together into tales of terrible tabletop misadventure, in the hopes that we could perhaps learn from these lessons, so that such fates do not befall our own tables. Or so we can just make fun of people on the internet. Don't worry, I won't kink shame you. Well, maybe a little. Today, we have a series of stories by user Mango Moonflower, centered around 2 problem players who are also a couple. So, without further ado, let's gather up a murder and dive right into this story. Part 1. So, this happened a little over a year ago. I have been wanting to post about these 2 for a while, but I had trouble getting the story to flow in a sensible way. I realized it was because, even though these 2 players were in a relationship, and wreaking havoc on our group during the same time, they were problematic in very different ways. For that reason, instead of trying to tell all of the events chronologically, I'll go over the 2 separately. With that being said, let's meet our cast. Ned, our first problem player. He played an edgy turtle necromancer with a weird fixation on bones. Most of his sins happen out of character. Natalie, problem player number 2. Played a changeling bard that had a tiefling appearance and a tiefling backstory. Was basically only a changeling for the lulz. Took the horny bard to a creepy level. Her sins were primarily in character. Everyone else will just be referred to by their class, because we had a big party, and I want to keep the word soup to a minimum. So for a little context, Natalie was a coworker of one of our group members, Monk, and approached her at work one day with interest in Dungeons & Dragons, as most of Monk's coworkers were aware she played. As luck, or misfortune in hindsight, would have it, we were about to start up a new campaign with some friends that had just moved into our area. Monk, who was friendly with Natalie as a coworker at the time, invited her and her fiancé, Ned, to join us with the DM's permission. As previously stated, I am focusing on 1 problem player at a time. So, I'll start with Ned, as most of his issues were out of character, and he was the lesser problem in my opinion. So, Ned was the reason that Natalie had approached Monk about D&D, since it was through his brother that they were made aware of TTRPGs. From what he had told us, his brother didn't want them joining, because they'd cramp his style. After playing with the 2 of them, my suspicions are that it wasn't the real reason. But his brother's character also had somehow ascended to godhood in Vampire the Masquerade? So who can say for sure? Ned seemed to fancy himself as an intellectual, and for that reason, wanted to play a wizard. He chose a turtle for no other reason than their bonkers armor class to balance out his squishiness. Now, the DM had given us a lore document that listed the common races and mentioned that exotic races were very rare. We tried to lead him towards a more conventional race, but since 3 of us were already planning to play exotic races, we had picked them out prior to the DM giving any solid statements about the setting. We didn't really have any ground to stand on. His issues, for me at least, started months before we even had our session 0. I am one of 3 artists we have in the group. All of us offered to do art of their characters for them, since it's just nice to have an idea of how the characters look. Now, I have an anime-inspired style that tends to be on the cuter side, as I use a lot of soft lines. Also, I typically draw humanoid characters. He asked me to do his character. Since it wasn't in my usual ballpark, I pointed him to our fighter instead, who has a much sharper style and is really good at monstrous designs. But he buttered me up by complimenting my style, and I eventually said I'd give it a try. I really wish I hadn't. He was the worst type of commissioner. I tried to get detailed information about what he wanted and maybe some reference images. He gave me very little to work with, just vaguely dressed with dead animal parts and some runic symbols. So, to make sure he was happy, I sent him progress pictures, the basic pose sketch, design sketch, color mock-up, etc., and he gave me the go-ahead at every step. Of course, that is until I had completely finished. All of a sudden, he wanted a complete overhaul of the design, even going back on stuff he specifically requested. I had to start over from scratch. And the way he offered critiques came off kinda rude, grading elements of the design on scores of 1 through 10. At least he kept the magnum opus of the OG design, a sash fashioned out of vertebrae and fishing wire. Now, him being a bad commissioner did put me off, but that didn't mean he was going to be a bad player, and for the most part, he wasn't. At least, not when he was in character. Despite an edgy backstory and him playing a necromancer in a good-aligned party, he actually played along with the party's desires. He did have some minor main character syndrome, but it could have been worked around. Outside of character, though, was a different story. He insisted at having Session 0 at their place, which was a nightmare for a number of reasons. While the rest of us lived fairly close to each other, they were nearly a 30-minute drive out of the way, in the middle of nowhere. He claimed to have a good space for playing, and considering that his older brother hosted his games, we were optimistic, and his brother's space did seem nice. Too bad, we were instead sequestered into the tiny section of the house dedicated for them. They had a decent-sized table, but most of their seating was uncomfortably low for the height of the table. On top of that, instead of traditional lighting, they had these color-changing rave lights. They also had a very excitable dog, who was all over the rest of us. While the majority of us don't mind a little dog snuggling, this dog was constantly trampling over someone, and his untrimmed nails left some of us with some decent scratches. Ned ended up putting him into another room, but Natalie argued for him to be let back out. Now, I didn't know about this until after we'd cut ties with them, but according to the other players, he said something along the line of, "Do we need to go into the other room and have a talk?" to her because of this. Ned also didn't like DM for some reason. If I were to guess though, with DM being one of the smartest people I know, and with Ned seeing himself as this intellectual, he might have felt threatened by him. On many occasions, he'd argue against our DM's rulings. One instance, during a non-canon battle royale we played, due to a player being out of town, our druid used Ice Knife on a creature he was next to. He failed his dex save against the Ice Knife's shattering effect and took the appropriate damage. He tried to argue with the DM that it still shouldn't have hit because of his turtle's shell. His turtle also had a thing for bones, and even had a ship made out of bone in his backstory. His obsession with them really became a problem when he tried to homebrew a spell, and I'll use the DM's own words because he put it best. "Guys, he wanted to be able to turn enemies into bone, no save, with a fucking level 2 spell. I asked him to look at other level 2 spells to get an idea of what power they have, and he was just like, I don't know, man. Seems like something I should be able to do already." He also didn't consult the DM when coming up with his character's backstory. In his backstory, an aboleth showed up and destroyed his entire people, leaving only him behind. While aboleths existed in our DM's world because of some flockery with the plane of water, they lived beyond 100 feet below surface and wouldn't have been able to come close enough to surface to pick off an entire people. He refused to work with our DM to come up with an alternative backstory, so our DM, frustrated, decided not to put any of his backstory details in the campaign. Less prevalent. But Ned also had this weird habit of parenting Natalie. He'd scold her for her decisions and use his character to make her behave more suitably, which, when we cover her, will make some sense. But this whole dynamic was just weird. This post ended up being way longer than I expected it to be. Next time, I'll cover the real big fish, Natalie. You can expect adventures of foot fetish shenanigans and boofing crab shells. Quick edit. So I showed this post to my party members, and Monk pointed out something that I forgot. During session 0 at their place, Ned also tried to convince Natalie to feed their dog a pot brownie to settle him down. I shouldn't have to explain why that is bad. Please, please don't give your dog a hash brownie. Ned's got a lot going on. For me, the immediate red flag is when Ned describes himself as an intellectual. It reminds me of people who describe themselves as alphas. Never a good sign. But if Ned's this bad and Natalie is supposed to be worse, I imagine we have a hell of a story ahead of us. And with that being said, let's move on to part 2. But before we move on to the next part of this story, I would like to thank today's sponsor, me. At long last, Crow's Perch now has its own official merch shop, which you can visit by following the link above or in the description, and get one of these cool mugs, okay? Anyway, back to part 2. Something I failed to mention in part 1, with the exception of Ned's art commission from Hell, all these stories all take place over the course of only 5 sessions. 6, counting the non-canon Battle Royale. So, DM is the type that likes to tie in backstories into the campaign, so he asked for us to write a little bit of background information and give it to him prior to session 0. While Ned gave DM a backstory that didn't really fit, at least he gave him something. The same could not be said of Natalie. She just wouldn't give him anything. It was so bad. He had to set a date for people to submit backstory information to him. She sent it on the day of. It was maybe 4 sentences long. Based on the writing style and how ignorant she seemed when the DM would bring up stuff from her backstory, we are almost 99% sure that Ned wrote it for her. So, right off the bat, session 0. It was pretty obvious that there was some disconnect with Natalie on what the tone we were going for was. We tend to play more serious games, and we thought we'd communicated that. She wanted to name her character Fart, and seemed very confused when we weren't on board with that name. Ned talked her into picking something else. She also didn't seem to realize there was math in Dungeons & Dragons, despite all the math rock jokes we were dropping in the Discord. So there were 2 primary goals of our session 0. 1. Help the new players with their character sheets. In addition to Ned and Natalie, Druid and Rogue were also new. 2. Group up the party. Getting the new players set up took longer than expected, so we were only able to get 3 players to the starting destination by the end of this session. DM requested everyone else meet up with him privately to get them to the same destination, so it wouldn't take up table time. Everyone agreed to this. But when it was Natalie's turn, she just continuously ghosted him until time for session 1 had rolled around. Outside of game, Monk asked her about this. It seemed like when the game was explained to Natalie, she fixated on the improvisation part and thought of it a whose line is it anyways type of game. She seemed to lose a lot of interest after it was explained that it was more of a character building and math kind of game. Most of us expected her to drop out before session 1. It was understandable, and no one was gonna blame her for not wanting to play, after realizing it wasn't what she thought it was. Well, she decides to play anyway. DM quickly cooked up the story that she was just kidnapped from her home island, and that's how she ended up on the slave ship that the rest of us were on. The issues start basically right away. So we start. We're all chained up. Ned uses 2 knock spells to get our fighter and monk out. Together, they take out the guard with a key, hand it off, and then head up deck to start chipping away at our other captors up there. Key makes its way to Ned, an important NPC captive, and then to Natalie. Now, instead of handing the key off to any of the 3 remaining PC captives, she decides to go off with the key and start skinning and looting the dead guard that is below deck. The rest of us are begging for her to unlock us. She doesn't. The NPC goes for the mace the dead guard had, so that he can help the PCs fight up deck. Natalie decides that she wants that mace instead, and is going to fight him about it. Here is where another issue comes up. She hasn't made up her spell list at all. Our ever-gracious and ever-suffering DM allows her to pick spells as we play, with the caveat that they will be locked into her spell list when she picks them. So she basically picks all her spells, with tormenting this one NPC in mind. Luckily, she's a bard, and she doesn't know much about spells, so the worst she does to this NPC is burn him with heat metal. Eventually, I just convince him to give the weapon to her in exchange for the key, with the promise that I'll make him a weapon he can use when he unlocks me. I play a creation bard, so finally, at the end of the session, Druid, Rogue, and I are able to get free. Session 2. Now that the whole party is free, we are able to start taking out captives at a faster rate. Meanwhile, Natalie's still below deck, harassing the same NPC who is trying to find his old gear. We eventually take over the ship with no help from her. We exchange names and end the session. As a side note, I would like to add that our problem player, Ned, spent a significant amount of time this session trying to swim away from the rest of the party for no real reason. Session 3. We find an item on board that converts salt water into fresh water, which is pretty crucial since we're in the middle of the sea. Unfortunately, one of the only container options we have is a magic rope Natalie found that can curl into a bowl. As a result, she is a tyrant about who gets what. The warlock decided to steal some water. She doesn't notice, but still metagames to find out it was him. Unnecessary PvP ensues. I end up placating her in character by having my character offer a token from her home island as payment for the missing water. Session 4. She played remote, so this was one of the only tolerable sessions she was a part of. Session 5. The real disaster session, which ultimately leads to them getting kicked. The first troubling incident of the night was when she argued with the DM about Ned getting to pick where his character ended up, after like a 4-hour downtime period. No matter how much our DM explained character autonomy, she just kept escalating it. Well, if he's below deck, I'm insert location several islands away now. Why was she so peeved about it? Well, she had you speak with animals to talk to some orcas that were curious about the ship our characters were on, and promised to feed them Ned's turtle. Druid, who had an herb pouch and a high roll, cooked up some pretty tasty food. Upon getting a whiff of it, several PCs asked her to cook their food for them. You know, like normal people. Not Natalie, though. She decides that Druid needs some buttering up. And by that I mean, she took this opportunity to get off on her IRL foot fetish by getting way too personal with Druid's feet. Toe sucking and all. Druid, having a very polite and passive player, tries to just tell her that that's not necessary. Doesn't work. Awkward laughter ensues. She also made a pass at Warlock in a similar toe-sucking manner, but Warlock's player was better at shutting it down. Later, she makes an offhand comment about planning to take my character's virginity to Fighter, who is my character's protector/father figure, which is made especially weird in character because my character looks young for her age, as a result of being an Aasimar, combined with Fighter calling her kid. Most were under the impression that she was underaged. We mentioned this to Natalie. She doesn't care. Time passes again, and she gets a hold of a bucket of multicolored crab shells that came from the fishing vessel our monk worked on prior to the campaign, where the rest of her crew got killed. Monk saw them and was sad, and went off to sulk in the captain's hut. Natalie wanted to hump the door of the cabin Monk went into, but thankfully, our DM stopped it with "The captain's hut doesn't have a door." Warlock, seeing how upset Monk was, attempted to get the crab shells as a way to cheer her up. Now, this is where it really escalates. Natalie was insanely stubborn, and wouldn't let Warlock have even one of them, despite multiple peace offerings from multiple characters. Warlock got fed up, and was planning to just try and swipe them from her. But she tried to metagame that she had laced them on a steel rope. And when the DM didn't allow that, she took it a step further, and said she wanted to have hidden them. Up her ass. It was at this point she seemed to realize that out of character, we were all kind of sick of this situation. Natalie: how many crab shells do I have to swallow to die? Because it seems like everyone just wants my character to die. DM: you don't have to do that. Your character can be difficult or raunchy. It's just that you're at an 11 right now, and I need you to be more of around a 7. Natalie: I just put a lot of myself in this character. DM: it's just that we like our games to be more serious, so the types of jokes we have in person don't really work in game. That doesn't mean we don't like you. We just need to tone it down. Natalie: but this is me toning it down. DM: and it would be fine if you just played your characters less contrary, and attempted less sexual things with fellow PCs without their consent. Natalie: are you calling me a rapist? DM: that's not what I'm saying. Okay, we're just gonna call it there and we'll talk over Discord, Natalie. After her and Ned left, the rest of the group had a discussion about their behavior and how we wanted to move forward. We agreed we would discuss the issues, and depending on how they responded, we'd give them 2 sessions to improve. If you did the math, you'll have a pretty good idea on how they responded to our critiques. Ned had some issues, but Natalie here just took the cake. They very clearly stated they wanted to have a more serious campaign, and Natalie immediately shoved crab shells up her ass. Between that and forcing her foot fetish upon the druid, and the strange comments about taking the Aasimar's virginity, and saying it straight to her father figure's face. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with people being raunchy at the table, especially because some groups will just have that kind of humor. Some of these events could even be things that just define the table. Something just raunchy, random, and stupid that got everybody to laugh. But, as was said in the beginning, this was supposed to be a serious campaign. Even in a serious campaign, it's okay to laugh. But this is being done at the expense of the other players, and clearly, it's making them uncomfortable. And seeing how there's a part 3, I don't think any of this is going to be getting through to Natalie or Ned. So without further ado, let's finish this story. So, when we left last time, the DM was planning to have a conversation with Natalie about the dumpster fire that was our last session. Turns out, he didn't even need to initiate. She messaged first, somehow still confused about what she was doing wrong, and why no one said anything to her directly. Our ever-patient DM listed out the grievances. Being contrary, trying to name her character Fart, trying to boof crab shells, the foot stuff, PvP, and not making an effort to learn how her class worked. He mentioned how we had in fact addressed stuff. We just did it in the flow of the game, so we didn't have to full stop to coach her about what she was doing wrong at every corner. She said she'd probably just quit and leave us to our game. Our DM gave her until 2 days before our next session to decide for sure. Ned also messaged the DM at the time to tell him that it was weighing heavy on Natalie and asking if he was doing anything wrong. To a lot of us, it almost seemed like he was trying to throw her under the bus with the way he phrased it. The DM said he was mostly fine in character, but the dynamic between him and Natalie made things tense sometimes. He also wasn't a fan of how Ned would be so questioning to his rulings. Ned just didn't respond. So the deadline DM set for Natalie rolls around. Now, has she decided to take our critiques and stay in the game? Or has she decided it's not for her, and she's going to stop playing with us? Neither. She's decided we were wrong, to say that she was doing bad. Because it was only that one time, and she's gonna keep going how she was. Great. The DM tried to point out other incidents and explain why they were wrong, but she just kept insisting it wasn't as bad as we were saying. We were honestly miffed. So we debated for a while whether we were gonna give her those chances to shape up, or if we were just gonna kick her because she seemed so unreceptive. Monk advocated for letting her have the second chance, mostly because of the coworker situation. The rest of us were over it, though. The fact that she was basically throwing out our concerns was so frustrating, and we couldn't see her improving. We also discussed whether to just kick her out, or to kick Ned out with her. This is when a lot of the incidents covered in Part 1 came out, so the majority ruled that both of them needed to go. The DM spends the day drafting up a message to kick them. We review it and make sure it's professional, and list out all the grievances so they can't deny them. We wait for Monk to get off work, so she doesn't have to be around Natalie when the news drops. Then we fire it off. They don't take it well, of course. Natalie starts chanting at us to tell it to her face, like a middle schooler trying to initiate a fistfight. Meanwhile, Ned, with his superior intellect, calls our conflict resolution skills subpar, and tells us how he'd rather not consort with us. I don't remember a lot of details after that, but it gets ugly. Monk, Warlock, and I stay on the sidelines, while Fighter and the usually passive Druid give them a verbal smackdown, occasionally tagging in DM and Rogue. Once things teetered out, Monk deleted the Discord with those two on it, and we moved to a friend Discord we had before. Natalie does text Monk later asking why she didn't defriend her, and Monk, to keep the work peace, just said that she didn't like confrontation. And that's the last we heard of them directly. Through work rumors, we found out that after they got married, they tried to change their names to absolutely bonkers names, which included religious and scientific terms they didn't seem to even understand the meaning of. The state naturally rejected the name change. They eventually moved out of our state, which we jokingly like to take credit for. And that's the end of our ordeal with the problem player couple. Luckily, we haven't had trouble with any other player before or since. But I have had some DM troubles recently. Depending on what comes of that, this may or may not be my last tale. Anyways, until then. To be honest, this isn't how I thought the story would end. Going out with more of a whimper than a bang. But maybe it's better that way. Ned and Natalie asked for criticism, and they got it. It just wasn't what they wanted to hear. But let's be real. Someone who unironically uses the word consort when talking about hanging out with his friends is probably someone you don't want hanging around you. To user Mango Moonflower, thank you for sharing your story. And here's hoping those DM troubles don't get so bad that they end up in my next week's video. Thank you for tuning in to today's stories. And if you have any thoughts about today's stories, be sure to leave them in the comments down below. And if you liked today's stories and would like to see more of them, be sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like on this video as we transition into Art of the Week. Art of the Week! This week's Art of the Week is once again brought to you by Dragon Trash, who drew this adorable set of crows. Ooh, a text bubble. I could be saying anything. Ka? Borb only sit. No think for Borb. Only sit. Yeah, that's a vibe. Also, at the bottom of this art is what I can only assume is Crit Crab, drawn to scale as a giant enemy crab. Thank you again, Dragon Trash, for your submission. If you would like your own art to be showcased on next week's Art of the Week, feel free to submit it on the Crow's Perch Discord, or you can always send it to me by email or DM me on Twitter. Once again, I'd like to thank the Crow's Perch patrons, like Cross, Damien Gerard, Novatonix, Shepdog, and Reuven Gritters. Borb only sit. Borb sit and read off the counts of Quills, like Kurito Kazuto, Shar K, Critical Kunic, Evix, King Drizzle, Christian Pip, Cosmosis, Kooky Spooks, Rikus, Vincent, Haley Thompson, Zero Fang, and Netscape Navigator. Gonna talk about them Barons of Beaks, like Kuntos Weasel, MoetisMaou, Chunky Salsa, Tech Blog, Kurestor, Cardispawn, AModestPastry, Jester King, Gintahl, Misfit, Gibber-Woods, Wormy, MulQueeny, Dana the Drake, McYeetly, we know about McYeetly, and Anja. And of course, we have the Dukes of Feathers, TheForgottenDruid, Jarett Suhr, Blues Otters, Zemlin, Staniel Das Boot, Henna, General Constantine Chase, HappyRex, Doxotti96, and of course, the piece de resistance, Acroth. You too can support the channel for as little as $1 a month by pledging to the Perch Patreon, link in the description down below. Every dollar of which I spend directly into food, but I could probably do something with it that's more productive, And with all of that out of the way, I will see you next time, as the crow flies.